Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are. Thank you for joining us in another installment of the Hinrich Foundation's webinar series. I'm Trinwei Yap. I'm a program director for research at the Hinrich Foundation. We're here today to talk about traceability in supply chains, which is sounds like a very technical term, but really it just means the ability of companies to develop vision on shipments and not just final goods, but raw materials, inputs, and all other parts of the supply chain. Joining me here today are Kati Suminen, founder and CEO of the Next Trade Group, which is a data and analytics company. Ahmad Behaki, who is a policy analyst at the APAC Secretariat, and Shamik Kundu, Chief Strategy Officer at True Era, which is a company that provides AI, artificial intelligence, quality management solutions. Thanks very much for joining me today, Kati, Shamik, and Ahmad. So before we get going, I just have a couple of things to remind anyone who's joining our session here today. This session will be recorded. And a copy of the recording can be found on the Hinrich Foundation website from next week. And there is a question and answer function within Zoom at the bottom of the screen, and you can leave your questions there if you have any for the panel to address. So coming back to traceability and Kati's excellent paper, fascinating paper, which if anyone hasn't yet, should really read on the Hinrich Foundation website. You can download it. And it talks about the paper that Kati wrote opens with a really evocative scene of just sundry goods, dolls and TVs and game consoles sort of piling up port side. And it's an image that we see more and more of these days as supply chain snarls just choke up our trade routes more and more these days. And most recently, we sort of see it coming back at airports with bags sort of piling up. So Kati would probably do a much better job of walking us through her findings. And then we'll open up to Shamik and Ahmad for their thoughts on the issue. Kati, you want to take us out from here?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me and for having us also to prepare this series on digital trade. It has been a really great collaboration, and also appreciate people joining us from, as I understand, around the world. I think you did a fantastic job at Hinrich Foundation to pick this topic, given its timeliness for, as you mentioned, for passengers today, but also for companies around the world over the past couple of years. And this issue is, of course, vital for us to facilitate trade, but it has also been an issue that's been with us for a long time. So, in 1962, Peter Drucker, who we know as the management guru, wrote this article called "The Economy's Dark Continent," referring to logistics as kind of the economy's black box that we didn't have much visibility into, yet companies that would be able to see inside the box and seeing that dark continent of the economy could reap significant value from having that ability to trace products and track their logistics. So with that, we've been putting together this primer, if you want, on traceability, introducing the topic more than anything, and really look forward to the great panel that you've convened also to discuss this. So just as in the 1960s, today we're also shedding light on the economy's dark continent in a way more globally today than back then. And of course, the supply chain shocks have really highlighted the issue and placed a premium on traceability. We can also think of traceability in kind of broader way as end-to-end visibility in supply chains, where you can track the raw materials and inputs in any one product. You could track and trace the location and condition of a product as it moves through, and as raw materials are included, and intermediate products, and finally the final product, kind of the entire manufacturing and shipping process. And then finally, we can also today increasingly trace goods after the point of sale, for instance, in vehicles. or in clothing even, we'll be able to track where those products go, and that raises probably issues that we want to talk about, like privacy and so on. Companies, when surveyed by companies like Bain, have highlighted many benefits from traceability, better audit trails for regulators, greater reliability of their operations, and then, of course, greater customer engagement. So companies absolutely see the value of this. If we think of a couple of ways in which there's more demand for traceability, one is, of course, to trace the state and location of goods in global supply chains. And many of us remember the blockage in the Suez Canal. If you were behind the ship that got blocked, or that blocked the entire traffic, you were out of luck. But of course, if you knew that your products were there behind this, and you were able to re-gear and recalibrate, reshift your logistics in light of this debacle, then you could resume operations. So traceability kind of enables these more reconfigurable, more flexible supply chains for companies, whether it's in moving the product or actually identifying a new supplier if your current supplier is unable to produce a product. Of course, all of us are now using e-commerce, and we're very eager to know where our stuff is. So this kind of traverses across the B2B landscape as well as the B2C. Another big kind of use case and area where there's a lot of demand for traceability is authentication of the origin and quality of products. So consumers increasingly want, particularly in food, they want greater transparency into what the ingredients are. But then we also have this trend of circular economy, where people are, for instance, able to sell used clothing, and somebody else treasures that as a new thing. Are these then fakes that are sold as Levi's jeans or as Gucci products, or are they the real ones? There's a big demand emerging for traceability there, and certainly also in industrial products, particularly as products are 3D printed, and there is kind of digital value chain as well, which is exposed to cybersecurity issues as well. And as I mentioned, this kind of downstream traceability, where we can enable consumers, or basically companies are able to track where, say, a car part goes, and how that car part, how old it gets, and when it needs to be replaced, is another big demand for traceability. And still another area is kind of managing supplier risk. Now, this has been, of course, with us for decades, ever since companies really started to be multinationals. Nike had some supply chain scandals in the 1990s in Southeast Asia, where you are. And of course, other companies like Mattel, which is apparently a fantastic company in monitoring its supply chain, had little girls ingesting lead from Barbie dolls and so forth. And that was another major challenge that set the company back for years at the time it occurred. And now, if we think of major airlines or car manufacturers, again, the amount of parts and components that are included in these marvelous machines is astounding, right? And the suppliers are tens of thousands of suppliers. Here you can just see a handful of the Boeing 787 suppliers. And of course, all of these have to deliver so that we can travel safely. And then something that we've been doing a lot of work on in my company is kind of understanding the movement of goods through the various intermediaries in international trade, and thinking about how, say, a freight forwarder that is contracted by an exporter, what it has to do, what kinds of documents and paperwork it needs to complete, and how the product then moves from the different parties to each other, from the freight forwarder or carrier to the shipping line, onto the terminal, onto the ship, through the customs, and so on. A lot of complexity also in just moving the products. And if we can digitize these kind of paperwork and handshakes that take place among these different players, again, that's a huge gain. We've calculated this, about 30% of global logistics costs could be saved if this was these complexities were reduced. And we got into a setting like this, much more interoperable setting, where we could then automate things like payments among the different parties. So great many use cases. I wanted to just highlight a couple of companies that are really exciting use cases that are solving for this. And with the idea that Peter Drucker had back in the 1960s, that there's really money to be made if you can highlight visibility in the supply chain. So one company that I'm a huge fan of is Everledger out of Australia. I had a chance to meet with the CEO many years ago, and she's done an amazing job in diversifying. At the time, they were all about authenticating diamonds using blockchain. And nowadays, they do all kinds of things like wine, art, and so on. And you can basically enable the winemaker to insert a little code in the bottle that the customer can then, for instance, at the dinner table, can just take a picture of the label or scan the label and understand the authenticate the product basically. And of course, Everledger has done great things also in the B2B space. For instance, with EV batteries, creating kind of batteries, a passport that enables parties in the supply chain to track, monitor the battery's condition. And this reduces also waste in batteries. Other companies, Walmart has their program that many people know about, using blockchain to trace the origin of food in the value chains. And of course, at the event of a major food recall, spinach or something is contaminated, if you can trace the origin of that bad spinach to its origin, you'll be able to save a lot of money and time and lives as well, as you don't have to recall everything, and you can get to the source of the problem immediately. And one of the companies that I admire very much, MasterCard, has another way of tracing perhaps suppliers. So through a trade directory called MasterCard Track, where they are able to leverage different data sources of suppliers and help companies that are seeking to establish those supply chain or supplier relationships to monitor the vendors, their compliance on an ongoing real-time basis, and of course then enable also supplier onboarding, payments, and supply chain finance. So really cool, nice use cases. Adidas is another one that had challenges with kind of greenwashing, but then established a partnership with a company called Trace, where they are able to literally monitor in real time the origin of the various ingredients, if you want, or products that go into an Adidas shoe. And of course, this has a number of gains, manage sustainability metrics to enabling consumers, us also, to understand where does our shoe really originate from, who is putting this all together. And it's an amazing array of players again. So something that we've been focusing on is these supply chain challenges here in the port of Los Angeles. I'm near the port, and the ships just kept piling up to the port at the end of last year. There are some technologies that have been around before as well, but have been taken to another level to enable all the parties in the chain, in the kind of shipping supply chain, to track the movement of products. So you can think of a chain like this, and the port optimizer technology enables one to track a container as it literally moves from the manufacturer and product leaves all the way to the destination. And you can see, if you went to the LA Port website and the port optimizer website, you could actually gain some visibility into what's going on in the port. So I downloaded this just today of all the port activity that is being produced by virtue of this data that's generated to the benefit of all parties that are kind of touching the shipment. So, something that I asked myself working on this is, what does the academia say? Are these kind of businesses that are having success with traceability technologies, are these really transformative, or are these kind of unique singular cases? And there's actually very recent academic work on different areas of traceability of cold chains, on green logistics, and the studies that I found that were rigorous and were really data-driven, had a lot of econometrics and so forth, did find great benefits as well. So there seems to be really a lot of value to be unlocked for companies like Everledger and others. Yet companies are not really yet leveraging all these technologies. If you believe in some surveys by KPMG, the traceability is still, particularly among SMEs, small businesses, tracked quite manually. So perhaps using Excel or with just basic stuff. Companies are a little bit concerned about kind of return on investment if they were to invest in traceability technologies, and also the human capacity, human capabilities to manage this. So I think we ended up with a couple of recommendations. Also thanks to Hinrich Foundation's team, who was also helping to think about this. And one is, of course, financing, particularly developing country SMEs' ability to access these traceability solutions and have the capabilities. The other is kind of addressing the weakest links in the supply chain. So you can think of, a most beautiful supply chain with great partners, but if one link is weak, that can really spoil the game for everybody else. In fact, the Europeans looked at the main supply chain disruptions over the past X number of years, and found that in just almost all those cases, there was just one supplier that had a cybersecurity incident, and that destroyed the supply chain for everybody. So it's really critical to address these weakest links and perhaps identify them, and then to incentivize all players to work together. It's not necessarily natural in a supply chain for everybody to want to share data, in particular, with one another. There may be competitive issues and so forth. So there could be perhaps a multilateral development bank or a government that steps in as a kind of honest broker and incentivizes everybody to play along. And then, of course, we need to track these KPIs better from this system. And Walmart has been really rigorous in forcing its suppliers to produce these performance reports, and perhaps this is a good idea. The small business may of course struggle to do this, but at least it gives an added layer of visibility. And then finally, something that I'm sure we'll discuss today is kind of enabling data flows across borders now in light of the proliferation of data transfer limitations around the world. So that's the paper in a nutshell, and really look forward to listening to the others share their views. Thank you.
Thank you, Kati. That was, one of the reasons why I just love this paper, and I just found this to be such a fascinating subject. I mean, ultimately, what we're sort of learning here is that the more we see, the more we learn what we don't see, and that's such a to me that's such a valuable project. It's a really valuable learning. And the other thing I sort of love about this paper and your findings is how minutely we sort of drill down into understanding what companies do, like Everledger, for example, and that slide that you showed on the Boeing plane with all the different parts and where it comes from. I mean, that to me is just fascinating. The Adidas slide, the sneaker's work is doing with TrustTrace, that is just fascinating stuff to me. And, just findings like how companies are still using Excel to trace. I mean, that's really just, it's funny, and it's extremely interesting. And this is just great exploration on supply chains. But Ahmad, I know that APAC has done quite a lot of work on interoperability, and that's something that is going to be increasingly important, as Kati says, going forward in traceability. So Ahmad, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thanks, Kathy, for the very insightful presentations, and Chunwei for the feedback. I'll just share my slides now. So basically, I will talk a bit about some of the work. Okay, can you see my? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so I'll talk a bit on what APEC has done on data flows and digital connectivity initiative. So back in 2014, APEC actually in this ministerial statement talk about the APEC statement on promoting the use of interoperable global data standards. Basically, it understands the contribution that global data standards can make to enhance supply chain efficiency, and also that GDS can be used to ensure that relevant information is being provided by all parties and stakeholders, and they have instructed officials to further advance work on global data standards. And PSU has been assigned to do 2 studies covering different range of products like wine, beef, box meat, asparagus, durian, and also tequila, covering different part of the supply chain that can show us what kind of benefits that can be derived from this sharing of data across supply chain stakeholders. So yeah, so basically this slide shows you the nature of GDS intervention. So we are using GS1 standards to sort of as a proof of concept on how the benefits from GDS can be established. So basically the GS1 involves many data points or serial numbers to different supply chains. So manufacturer will have their own GLN and GTIN, like the ID of the product, and whereas distributor also being assigned by a different set of numbers that will enable them to track where the shipments is going through, and even tracking in terms of the temperature. So it will allow, as Kathy mentioned, an end-to-end supply chain, and where the data can be shared from different stakeholders. So basically, the pilot project used interoperable cloud-based EPCIS platforms to capture data in the cloud throughout the supply chain to provide visibility and data sharing to relevant stakeholders. Hence, it will enable better communication across stakeholders. So in a sense, GDS provides a common language to identify, to capture and share supply chain data to stakeholders along the supply chain through use of certain technologies like RFID and barcodes. So, and from some of the benefits from the GDS pilot is that in terms of efficiency, it has been shown that by using GDS, supply chain stakeholders can have a faster and accurate capturing of product information. In terms of integrity, it can prevent detention of products in ports, which is, as you all know, is very costly. It also improves better authenticity. And this is very important for products such as tequila, because that sort of prevent forgery of products, which can be harmful to the consumers. And so it actually involves, you could actually save lives if you could prevent such a counterfeit products. And it also enables traceability among stakeholders. It allows real-time package tracking and immediate retrieval of information. It allows temperature monitoring, which is important for for products such as durian that's being trial in the pilot, because once the temperature falls below certain level, then it could damage the product. And I guess one of the important thing is, how do we include GDS in the border control? So in addition to the supply chain stakeholders, by encouraging border control to also use GDS, it can improve the accuracy and comprehensiveness of data, and as such, it can focus agency resources on more targeted activities. So it allows the customs, in principle, to better allocate their resources and subsequent time saving. So basically allows customs to have a better risk management system. And I guess as mentioned on the data flows, different regions, different economies have different regulations. So while we identify several trends related to this technology, whereas emerging technologies has facilitated trade by integrating digital technology, we have the example of single window. However, the diversity of digital policies across economies actually illustrate the tough decisions that policymakers have to make when they balance data protection and trade facilitation. And in relation to the current COVID pandemic, digital strategies are increasingly being used to operationalize solutions to manage the movement of people across borders, like in the case of vaccine interoperability. So actually, a lot of this digital innovation has been more or less being encouraged due to the COVID pandemic. And some of the approaches that APEC members to improve to digital connectivity is by building a reliable data ecosystem to balance objectives of privacy, protection, and free information exchange. In the case of Australia, they have the CDR system that try to balance these things. And also in the case of APEC single window, we try to develop interoperable data systems to facilitate digital transformation. It has been done in the Pacific Alliance as well as in the ASEAN single window. And lastly, okay, what's the way forward? I think Kathy mentioned about the importance of sustainability. So for the Thailand host year, they have put up this concept of a bio-circular green model. So basically, it's a post-pandemic growth strategy. It promotes the use of efficient use of resources, maintain and restore the ecosystems, and reduce waste. Basically, it's a 3P. You know, you need to focus on the people, on the planet, but also need to think about the profit. And I guess it's important to see how we can integrate BCG to supply chain practices. Kathy have mentioned how digital technology can actually improve supply chain visibility. And I think the important thing is that the lead firm needs to sort of assist their suppliers in terms of guiding them to improve their sustainability issues. And also, the second point is that we need to realize that being resilient is also being sustainable. So many of the supply chain visibility instruments or tools that Kathy had mentioned can be used to improve visibility, which can improve the resiliency of supply chain, because now the lead firm will know how their suppliers being configured, and actually it provides opportunities for the lead firm to encourage their suppliers to be more sustainable. I think Kathy mentioned about the experience of Walmart, and I have something on my notes here. So yeah, in 2014, Walmart launched a program to help thousands of its suppliers to make their factories more energy efficient through the use of online tools. So, and these things actually help SMEs as well. And lastly, I think it's important to see how promotion and enforcement of BCG standards and guidelines, because having standards and guidelines to promote sustainability is important. Many firms will react favorably if they know what they need to do and how they could do it. So we need to have some sort of coordination of business and public policies, so that we can sort of have both the private and government standards being used in a complementary way. Especially, we have a global supply chain, so one product can come from these economies which have different standards, and from other economies which have different environmental standards. So we need to think about how to do this enforcement in an efficient manner, while still allows SMEs to participate and benefit. I think I've over my time, so yeah. So that's all I have for now. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ahmad. That was fascinating. I mean, just to know that things like temperature becomes a factor in traceability. And the other very salient point that you brought up is that increasingly these are issues that can save lives. In the light of COVID, I mean, that's something that's made it very clear. And one question, I think, from your presentation that I think we can discuss later in the question and answer session is that it sort of strikes me that different countries would have different capacities in being able to respond to this in terms of interoperability, but it's something that I expect we'll discuss a little bit later. And if there's anyone here in this panel who's more suited to talk to us about this issue from a corporate perspective. There's probably no one, no one better than Shamik Kundu, who has overseen thousands of employees in his job with True Era, as well as dealing with artificial intelligence, which is in a way all about honing that visibility. So Shamik, over to you.
Thanks very much. I don't have slides, so hopefully I'll be able to relatively quickly finish. I'm actually going to talk about a different supply chain. Both Ahmed and Kati talked about the benefits from visibility and traceability. You talked about the technologies that can be used. But I think I just like to warn, as somebody who's kind of been looking at data even inside a single organization. I worked at Standard Chartered Bank before this, 80,000 odd people across 60 plus countries. And imagine this is a bank, so there's not much physical movement happening out here. And it has its own its system, so the standardization is a given. And despite that, being able to ensure that accurate information about essentially digital things is flowing from one part of the bank to another is a challenge. And it's not unique to this bank. Every single bank, every single large organization like that will have that. And the reason I'm mentioning that is I think while it is an extremely desirable objective, I think it would be useful to think about the fact that in parallel with the physical supply chain, there are actually two other supply chains, and we'll only talk about one of them today. One is a financial supply chain, and one of your slides, Kati, had that. It had the correspondent bank, the intermediary bank, and so on. That's a different story. I mean, it is connected to the other two supply chains, but I'll leave that for the moment. The other is the data supply chain, right? And Ahmed, your slide, the one which had all the barcodes on it, that talks about the data supply chain. And a lot of what you talked about, standards, was music to my ears, because I think that is a key element. So what do I mean by the data supply chain? In theory, in an ideal world, that picture you put up, Ahmed, with all the steps having an associated IoT, I'm using IoT as a generic term, but an Internet of Things equivalent way of collecting the data, that would all work and everything would flow through. And then you highlighted challenges around interoperability, you highlighted challenges around privacy and other issues. But I think there is more basic stuff. Often in the real world of data, things often fail for some far more stupid or basic reasons, right? So let me give one example. Suppose you are scanning the RFID tags on a product, right? You're scanning it, it's working, it's beeping if you're doing it as a human, or it's a machine, it's beeping and it's all going through. What you might not know is that there is a bug somewhere in the system, which means that it is repeating the same RFID multiple times, right? Now, of course, that's a stupid example because you can easily check and say, if RFID repeat, highlight that alert. But now I come back, Chinmay, to your question of capability, because well, actually, not every system, not every company will have the ability to think about data management in that way and say, oh, I must build data quality tests, because if I don't, I must actually use artificial intelligence to detect unusual patterns in the data. Not to actually look at the visibility of the supply chain, but to look at the quality of the data that's coming in. Now, it might sound too far out there, but actually, all the dreams about data analytics, AI changing the world, they fail at such very basic, I will repeat the word, stupid barriers. I mean, I say stupid not because they're like it's an individual who's stupid, but it feels like, come on, this is so basic, right? Well, how can that happen? The reality is that trips up people far more than anything else. So I would say a lot of attention is required to the design of the way in which data is collected. It's difficult enough inside organizations, but when you do it across organizations, across countries, at different levels of capabilities, as you said, Chinmay, you have to do it in a way that is disaster-proof, idiot-proof, like, it will work with 5 different redundancies built in to make sure that it doesn't crash. Otherwise, you might end up with very difficult outcomes. And those things can also trigger, you never know when you have a data supply chain, if one error is leading to a mistaken impression of how much of a particular part is being supplied to Airbus. For all you know, it might actually lead to overproduction of a part and all the other things that go with that. So that's one angle I wanted to bring. The other is, I think we talk often about privacy and about interoperable standards, but we should, in my view, be more worried about sovereignty, and worried not necessarily in a sense of, oh, we all have to get rid of data sovereignty. It isn't happening. It's not going to happen. Countries are going to be worried about the implications of sharing data. And you might say, well, it's not personal data. Why does it matter? I'll give you an example in a minute about Serbia and a tennis player, which will illustrate the point. But people, of course, talk about privacy. The reality is there aren't that many differences between countries on privacy laws. There used to be a time when China was the wild east, if you will. US was the wild west, and Europe was somewhere in between. Right now, China has arguably the strictest privacy and data ethics rules. Europe is catching up, and the US, certainly California, has caught up. So I actually think the concerns about different data laws in different countries are overblown. The concerns about lack of standards, that's an important point, but organizations such as yours are doing the work. I think the one that we should be worried about is, this is a level of visibility that can have unintended implication. And the example I wanted to give, of course, was of the Serbian #1 tennis player who was accused of getting into for the Australian Open, if you remember, Djokovic, with a false COVID test, right? And the way it was detected was because the test numbers was open sourced, and somebody said, look, the test number that was provided is later than the other tests that were taken on that date. Therefore, this test could not have happened before a particular date. So effectively, publicly available data on COVID tests sequencing was used to not just find fault with Djokovic, but frankly, it raised a huge question mark on how the government of Serbia had actually intervened on his behalf and cooked up things. Now, why do I give this thing? You can argue, well, this is a good thing, isn't it? If traceability of this is actually part of traceability of supply chain, because it actually is linked to a test piece, right? If traceability of these things provides greater sunlight all around, yeah, isn't it great that it was caught? Maybe. But the reality is we all live in a real world with real geopolitics. And we should be wary of governments or even countries, like the peoples of countries, somehow giving up all of their sovereignty on data. Data is the new frontier for sovereignty. And we should expect that countries will have a lot of stake in protecting their data, arguably sometimes keeping their secrets. And instead of hoping for a situation in which all these barriers automatically disappear, we need to plan for a data supply chain that accommodates all these concerns around privacy, sovereignty, data quality, etc., and build for that. Only then would the wonderful visions that all of the examples that Kati mentioned, they work. I mean, my own experience with AI projects, which inside an organization, for example, is they work in isolation for a while as a pilot. But if you want to scale this up, you need to think in terms of how to make them sustainable, including, for example, initiatives like yours, Ahmed, on the data standardization that will play a big role. So with that, I'll stop because I know we have a panel discussion. We can continue the discussion in the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Shamik, and thanks for that presentation. It was great. It's really your understanding of financial supply chains and data supply chains that are really helping us to sort of figure out that, again, to figure out what we cannot see and what we don't understand. We're just sort of starting to get a better picture on that, which is really interesting. And I love the analogy that you drew with Novak. No, it's not an analogy. Novak Djokovic is an example. That's great. Just as an aside, I mean, the Grand Slams continue to elude him, and I don't even know if he's eligible to re-enter.
He didn't go to the US as well, yeah.
No, he didn't go to the US. Is he like eligible to go to AL? Like, it's not yet decided, right?
Not yet decided. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, but coming back to traceability, and you bring up really important questions of privacy and sovereignty, both of which I think separately we should be addressing in Q&A if that's possible. While we wait to see if anyone is going to put a question in, I thought I'd start us off with a question about exactly the issue of privacy. And I wanted to know what you guys think of whether there is a trade-off at all between ensuring traceability and privacy. I mean, Shamik spoke a little bit about this, especially with respect to cross-border data transfers. And I thought maybe Kati, you could start us off. with your thoughts on
Yeah,
it.
yeah, it's a big question, and like Shamik said, some of this doesn't pertain in traceability in products and supply chains that much to personal data, but there are still issues of also with that non-personal data, and you can also think of things like companies wanting to ensure that their data on suppliers remains confidential. It's a kind of business secret, and then we're seeing that actually in interesting places like customs records, where companies are, at least in the United States, able to block their name or able to block their suppliers' names from customs records, so that competitors do not find out who those suppliers are. And studies have shown that there's more and more and more of that activity of kind of blocking the names of suppliers in customs records. And then there are, of course, IP issues, having the confidentiality around that. So that's one set of issues. And then there are these personal data and privacy issues that, of course, go beyond traceability in supply chains. But you can think of, for instance, these downstream traceability of, say, car parts in a vehicle, and all the complexities that emerge when you start to think about the suppliers of those parts, the OEM, the car repair shop next to the person who is driving the car, and who actually has then data on, say, that part that the driver could be replacing at some point when the part is old, which of course reveals certain things about the driver. And of course, cars are able to capture much more about us and where we are driving and what establishment we frequent and so forth. So these kinds of issues where we're actually able to then trace the data of consumers downstream after the point of sale, these I think raised particularly thorny issues. And like we've discussed, the data privacy laws are emerging everywhere. We actually did a mapping of data privacy laws in Africa and found that there's a tremendous amount of activity just in the past couple of years on countries establishing their privacy laws, as there is, of course, in Southeast Asia has been for a long time. But then we have this complexity of kind of data transfer regulations on top of the data privacy. And there, perhaps we have a little bit more complexity in terms of how transfer is managed. And I think, Ahmad, you gave the great example of APEC. APEC has, of course, its CBPR system, which is kind of a voluntary industry way to monitor data transfer and enable companies to engage in data transfer. And then we have the extreme case of kind of Vietnam's new cybersecurity law that really complicates moving data out of Vietnam. And so, we'll negotiate these issues for a long time, where I would, invite some commentary from others. And of course, something that I've been looking at is how technology could solve for this. Could we, for instance, through encryption technologies, and something that is taking off really with large companies, confidential computing, solve for some of this, where companies are able to share data more easily as it's being used by a third party, even in another country. So, and do that in a kind of confidential manner. So hopefully, there could be technology use cases as well to solve for this issue as we enhance traceability also.
Thank you, Kati. Shamik or Ahmad, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, maybe I'll add a little bit on the last point, Katya. So I do actually lead a multi-country initiative as part of the Global Partnership on AI on privacy enhancing technologies, which includes federated computing and various encryption technologies, etc. And we just spent 6 months trying to find a suitable cross-country project as a candidate for demonstrating the power of these technologies. We did actually look at trade supply chain related projects as well. The interesting thing is that it almost doesn't matter what the technology can or cannot do. There is a supply and demand issue. The supply of technologies to make this happen is already there. To your question, if you had a world government which was completely technocratic and they looked at the state of technology today around privacy enhancing technologies, they would blindly agree to moving data anywhere. The reality is we don't have a world government. We don't have a perfectly technocratic set of governments. And so what we found is that the so-called custodians of data, as well as those who are going to live with taking that data and do something with it, they were wary of using the technology, saying, no, I know this technology works, but I'm not sure if I'll get in trouble for this, or what if there is a breach despite me using the technology, etc. Which brings me to the real contribution I wanted to make here is, to me, the danger in all this is, I know it'll sound bad, but is almost in being too ambitious. I think there is just, in your paper, Kati, there are so many different things you could do with supply chain visibility. And the more you do them in a universal manner, meaning you collect the data once and it can be used for all these purposes, the better it would be. Absolutely. But the more you want to make it universal, the tougher these challenges become. So my thought would be that, international trade and policy associations and bodies should focus on a few objectives. And I think in many ways they are, something around slave labor prevention, or kind of misuse of labor prevention, something around green pieces, but in particular areas. So the more we narrow it down, I think we will have more success, because then you have fixed objectives. You can live not just with privacy enhancing technologies, Kati, but you can also do data minimization, meaning what is the bare minimum I need to prevent misuse of child labor, right? Or this particular use case. What is the bare minimum I need to understand the use of non-renewable goods or components in an electronic supply chain? And then when I come with that data minimization mindset, I'm able to kind of get over these boundaries much easier, right? I won't even touch most countries' privacy laws. Most people will be like, yeah, that data doesn't matter. I can let you go. The downside of that is that you'll end up with a whole bunch of different solutions for individual problems. And you lose the standardization angle, Ahmad, that you were talking about. So to me, an answer to your question, Chinwe, there is a trade-off. And that trade-off in turn leads to these two approaches. There is the world is ideal. We must collect all the data we can about supply chain in one big blockchain and everything will be fine, which is the most efficient way of doing it, but it's extremely unlikely to work. And then there is we all should focus on our individual pieces. And as we do so, we use agencies like Ahmad's or companies like Kati's to drive some degree of standardization across them. But let's not dream that it's going to be all uniformly standardized around the world. That would be my view.
Thank you, Sharik. Otherwise, we might end up with a traceability equivalent of the WTO.
It's a good way of putting it. Yes.
So I'm told that we're running up against time. So I'm just going to throw one last question out there to you guys. And it's going to combine a couple of issues, mainly looking at transferability of data across borders and how in APAC economies in particular, maybe different countries can approach it differently. And also the question of whether some countries do traceability better than others. And maybe we have Ahmad start us off on that.
I think, okay, I'm unmute already. Right? Yeah, I guess we could, Kathy mentioned about the CDPR. So it's mostly similar with the EU GDPR, although EU GDPR adopt a top-down approach. CDPR is the bottom-up approach. So we focus more on the domestic regulation and see what's the overlaps and how economies can cooperate across the different domestic data regulations. And I think we can also look the approaches among different economies through their different trade agreements. We have the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, we have the CPTPP, we have the USMCA, we have the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that was initiated by Singapore, all have a certain clause or section on data regulation. But I think it is a good start. So I think all trade agreements commit to broad principles of digital economic freedom, such as imposing no customs duties on electronic transmission and digital products. And they also allow the WTO principle of non-discrimination for the digital space. And each agreement also promotes liberal data flows by more or less discouraging data localization requirements. Although, of course, different agreements may have different emphasis and different ambitions on how they want to achieve, a cross-border data-driven economy. I guess CPTPP and USMCA probably take a more facilitative stance towards cross-border data flows. But RCEP also has certain sort of efforts to minimize minimize differences in how data could flow across borders. And I guess I would agree with what Samik said, that we need to start building up from all of these different nuances of agreements and domestic regulation. So we need still to aim high, but we need to realize that progress are mostly incremental. But I still quite optimistic that they're probably not soon, but in the long run, all of these different trade agreements, different domestic regulation would somehow achieve certain similar level of standards that allows a more free flow of data across different economies.
Yeah. I'd second that, Ahmad. I think slowly and then suddenly is what's likely to happen. I think we will make progress slowly. I've certainly seen this in my commercial role inside a bank as head of data for the bank. There's a lot of objections, but I couldn't actually find, with the exception of one country, which I shall not name, across all of Standard Chartered's network, I didn't actually find an instance where if we really wanted, with certain safeguards, we could not exchange data between countries, right? And there were lots of rules around what you can or cannot do. But in the end, there was no country except one that genuinely prevented you from accessing the data you needed. It required a lot of workarounds, do this, do that, add this. And that's the point, Ahmad. We should probably try and not imagine that it will somehow magically get solved, but work slowly, incrementally. And when you do it, collectively, those incremental pieces will start looking like, okay, this thing works. I mean, it's not 100% there, but collectively it's 70-80% of the way there. Yeah.
Yeah, if I were, as well, I fully agree with Ahmad and Shamik on this. And when you look at, we've been actually looking very closely at the trade agreements and how they regulate data transfer. And the good news is that across these trade agreements that now have digital trade chapters, the language is extremely similar, almost basically a carbon copy of CPTPP. So there's kind of de facto harmonization going on. The challenge, however, that we have found is that some, like RCEP, is not necessarily binding in the digital trade chapter. And then the compliance and the enforcement is kind of half-hearted and patchy for countries. So I think there is something that we're actually working on now is thinking about how countries and these regional blocks can monitor the implementation of the digital trade chapters, which is a challenging kind of subjective task since we're not dealing with very numerical systems. We're dealing with kind of broad principles that are almost difficult not to comply with. But I think there's a body of significant body, growing body of countries that are adhering or signing up to common standards like that, and that's very good news, definitely. And to Shamik's point, definitely, I think there is a way to completely agree that there's a way to get around these challenging rules. The challenge then, of course, becomes can kind of smaller businesses and SMEs navigate this system. And what we've seen in kind of e-commerce, looking at how small businesses are able to diversify across markets using e-commerce. But then when you have different kinds of data, privacy, and also consumer protection rules across markets, that kind of freezes their ability to diversify. So they pick one or two corridors. And this is a big challenge, I think, for us to precisely to Ahmad, your point, to ensure that we have similar rules across landscape so that small businesses can diversify. They don't necessarily have the capabilities to hire Shamik to navigate the data challenges.
Well, great. Well, thanks very much, Kati, Ahmad, and Shamik. That was a really fascinating excursion to what is really the frontiers of supply chains. Anyway, thanks very much for joining our webinar today. Just on a final note, a little bit of housekeeping that I need to do. We will be sharing a closing slide It's up right now actually. So QR code URL to our website. Please subscribe to our newsletters so that we can tell you when the webinar recording and any accompanying slides will be released. And thank you again to our three panelists today. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.